G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas, and what a treat we have today. One of the most consequential Australian politicians in recent history, Alexander Downer, who was the Foreign Minister of Australia, which is what Americans call the Secretary of State, for those American listeners. During the Iraq War, 9/11, he was at the helm of a very successful Conservative government headed by the Prime Minister John Howard for over a decade, and subsequently became Australia's ambassador to the United Kingdom. Now, in a weird quirk of terminology, ambassadors between Commonwealth countries are called High Commissioners. So when you hear us talk about the High Commissioner to the UK, that's just a fancy way of saying ambassador, because Australia and the UK are both Commonwealth countries. And while he was the ambassador / High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, he had a drink with a gentleman named George Papadopoulos, who was on the Trump campaign before Donald Trump was elected president. And Papadopoulos mentioned something about the Russians having dirt on Hillary Clinton. Now, Downer, as the Australian ambassador to the United Kingdom and obviously a member of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance between the sort of Anglophone countries, very close with the FBI and the CIA, thought that it might be appropriate to alert American law enforcement about the fact that an allegation had been made that a foreign adversary was going to interfere in the 2016 election. Thus began Russiagate, the Mueller Investigation, and a huge amount of global kerfuffle around this inciting incident, which Downer was part of. I wanted to pick his brain about that. I wanted to pick his brain about what it was like to be the foreign minister at some of the most trying times in recent history, and what it was like to be fundamental to essentially coordinating the Western security response to jihadism, the Islamic State, after 9/11, and Al-Qaeda. In Australia, Alexander Downer is a household name. He recently wrote about the UK race riots, and that's really the pretext for having this conversation. So you'll recall that last month there were riots in the United Kingdom that were fueled by a deep kind of resentment towards the pace of immigration. Maybe they were certainly racially motivated racist riots in the case of some of the offenders. But the underlying sort of conditions for those riots, as Alexander Downer sees it, is a failure of elites and of successive governments to really address the integration of migrant communities and to have an honest conversation about immigration in the UK. So as a man who has lived in Australia and the UK, and both Australia and the UK, he's well positioned, and in New York also, when he did a lot of, had a lot of appearances at the United Nations, which is headquartered there. He has a fundamental understanding about the way that migrants can and cannot integrate into societies. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did, the one and only Alexander Downer. But I'm interested in you anyway. What are you doing in Thailand?
I'm here to make a speech to a energy association for their annual dinner. I'm just the guest speaker to talk about geopolitics and the state of the world.
Do you tire of travel?
I woke up this morning and I was asking myself that question. God, I flew up here from Sydney yesterday, and I'm going from here to the Gold Coast to make another speech there, and then back to Adelaide for a week, and then I'm going to Melbourne to make a speech there. I do a lot of speeches.
It's pretty good. I mean, there are worse ways to make a bob.
There are. I mean, there are many worse, yeah. What do I think? I mean, it's nice to come to different countries, but Bangkok, it's not my favorite.
I love Bangkok, Alexander.
What's so lovely about that?
I mean, it's got a bustle. What's that?
Have you been to Vienna or in Southeast Asia, Hanoi?
Yes, Hanoi's fabulous. I mean, they're all very different places. Hanoi has that kind of charm and
Hanoi, right,
and beauty about it. But I do like a bit of chaos. I feel like the world is divided into people who prefer Singapore to Bangkok and Dubai to Cairo. And I've always been on the on the Cairo Bangkok side of that equation.
Cairo is brilliant. I love that. And I mean, you have to understand Cairo. You have to know where to go, to buy the bakeries and things like that. The sort of Arab bakeries and all sorts of wonderful things to do in Cairo. It's an incredibly Singapore. Well, it's sterile.
Mm. That's what
Like,
I mean. I mean, some people like that. Some people like the Dubaiification and Singaporeification of everything. But
well, yeah, I know it's being recorded, but I'm not a great lover of Dubai.
why is that?
Sterile, nothing.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, I was stuck there once because some problem with the plane, and I was just stuck there for 48 hours or whatever it was. And I mean, after about 3 hours, there's nothing to do. You can go and look at the shopping malls; they're just amazing. But I mean, I do. I spend part of my time in Palo Alto at Stanford University, and there's a Stanford shopping mall, which is might as well be the Dubai.
Yeah. That's right. I don't remember which Gulf state capital it was. It was either Abu Dhabi or Dubai or Doha. I passed through all of them a lot, and they become indistinguishable after a while. But I remember being told that I had to go to the souk, to the local, markets, because it was so authentic. And I went down there, and they were things that were built in the 1980s to look like a traditional souk, and it's a bunch of expats walking around. I was like, what is going on? Give me Istanbul or Cairo or, any day.
So Cairo has an amazing souk. There are a lot of tourists in the Cairo souk, but nevertheless, it's huge and it is amazing. Dubai, the souk, the gold souk, right? It's completely uninteresting and hugely expensive.
Yes, it was either that or it might have been in Doha. I can't remember. What are your favorite places in the world as a well-traveled diplomat? You mentioned Vienna and Hanoi.
It depends on my mood. London is the great meeting point of the world. I mean, Dr. Johnson saying, if you're tired of London, you're tired of life is true. There is everything to do in London. As somebody from Sydney very smartly said to me once, well, that's not quite true. Where can you go surfing in London?
I mean, the other thing that London doesn't have is vast expanses of nothingness, which Australia has bucket loads of.
No, and that exactly. But I mean, if you're just thinking of a city, you're not looking for nothingness.
No, that's true.
England doesn't have. Scotland has some nothingness, but England not a lot of nothingness. There are different things to see there, not nothingness. America is great for nothingness.
America's great for everything. I mean, I spent most of my professional life in New York City, which I feel the same affection and excitement towards New York as you and Samuel Johnson do towards London. There's just nothing that can't be done in New York, and you can also get out of it reasonably quickly. And
thing on Long Island, I suppose.
You can, exactly. There you go. We win. You lose. Let's talk about London. Let's talk about England. You wrote a great piece in The Australian about what's going on in the UK, and you make the point that with respect to the race riots, that eruption has not happened without a broad context. What's the context?
Yeah, the context is the British failure to make multiculturalism work, and this requires a bit of discussion because people confuse multiculturalism with multiracialism. In a country like the UK, which once had an empire which spanned most of the world, multiracialism is not an issue. People are not fussed about people's race, what color they are, whether they have curly hair or straight hair. People are not fussed at all about that. The issue is in a way quite different. It's about culture, and they have brought a large number of migrants into the UK. These people come from countries that were, and now one would say, were part of the Commonwealth, were part of the British Empire. The problem is that in some cases there has been no effort to integrate those people. And so they've gone to, I mean, a percentage of them have gone to live in enclaves The enclaves carve out parts of major cities like Birmingham and Manchester. In some cases, pretty much ethnic groups pretty much taken over whole towns, or the bigger part of towns. So they've established in the UK a patchwork of enclaves without any effort to try to integrate people who have come into the country, and so you have separate cultures living side by side. And this is for those people who are the migrant or the descendants of the migrants. It's a disadvantage because they are not integrated and therefore they don't have the opportunities that they would have if they did integrate. And for people who are part of the broader mainstream of British society, they resent these enclaves and then they start to resent the people. And so it's a slightly complicated story, but it is about having a policy of integration. And it's nothing to do with race. It's about integration and about finding common values that bind the country together, regardless of where people have migrated from. If you don't have some common narrative and common values, then the country just becomes a gigantic hotel. And
But Alexander, what does integration look like and mean? Because ever since I was a boy, I've been told that integration is actually not the point of a society, for example, like Australia's, that multiculturalism is about finding a unity without enforced integration, that, we can sort of respect the diversity of all the newcomers.
Well, I think this is the difficulty with language. There was another word that was used and has been banned now, and I'm in favour of not abandoning the word, but of abandoning the concept, and that is assimilation. We're not looking for people to assimilate, to all become the same, to have a sort of intellectual and cultural homogeneity in our society. It's good to have diversity in the society, but there must be some common values that bind people together. There must be something that binds the people of the country together. If, for example, they live in ethnic enclaves, like as has happened in the UK, they speak the language of the countries they came from and don't learn English, and there's a lack of English language skills in some of those British enclaves. They don't move out of the enclaves. Then they become, if you like, separate countries within a country. And that is not going to work. So somehow you have to, and the government has to take the lead on this, you have to establish the common values of the country and make sure that migrants, as they come into the country, are committed to those common values. They're the cliched things like a commitment to liberal democracy, an understanding of the rule of law, how laws are made, the obligation of a citizen to obey laws, the obligation of citizens to contribute as well as to take from society, various different values, which have got nothing to do with if you're a migrant from Rwanda wanting to continue to practice some of the practices that you feel culturally comfortable with from Rwanda. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, banning that sort of behavior, which is what assimilation essentially does, is entirely the wrong thing to do. But a country will cease to be a country. You will cease to be a nation if you don't have some common values that bind you together. It's a huge challenge, this, because when you talk about values, they sound like a list of cliches. And some of them might be cliches, but they're still important. And people physically don't have to sign up to these values, but there has to be a sense that they embrace those values, because if they don't, then society will fragment. And that's what's happened in the UK. I mean, not to defend the people who've been rioting and burning police cars, and in one case threatening to burn down a motel with refugees in it. That's, preposterous and criminal behavior. But this doesn't come from nowhere. This comes from somewhere. And this comes out of that sense of resentment that that they have been unsuccessful, if you like, in integrating migrants into the UK. They can blame all sorts of people. You can blame the migrants, you can blame the government, you can blame the indigenous people. It doesn't matter. The fact is, it is a problem there, and it's a problem that's caused resentment and creates political and social problems, which I think are going to get worse there before they get better.
Is there something particular, Alexander, to the situation in the UK? Because the retort that I would expect to hear from against what you just said is, look, when people first arrive in a place, it's unreasonable to expect them to hold all of the same values as that place. I mean, they're from a different place. When my grandparents came to Australia as penniless refugees from war-torn Europe after the Second World War, what appreciation did they have for liberal democracy? I mean, my grandmother was a communist in Poland. She didn't understand liberal democracy, but over time she let's not say assimilated. She integrated. She inherited the norms of the culture around her. And over time, subsequent generations normalize, get absorbed, bump into other communities, create a roiling melting pot that gropes its way towards the liberal democracy that sort of undergirds the political structures and leaches its way into those communities. Why do you have to enforce it or guide it? Why isn't it just organic?
I don't like the word enforce. You can't force people to do anything, but at least that in my book. But why do people want to come to the UK in the first place? They don't want to come there because it's a country that practices Sharia law, and they're able to live out the life that they might be living out in Pakistan. That's not the reason they go there. They go there with a full understanding of what, a full is an exaggeration, with an understanding of what Britain is about, as they do when they come to Australia. I mean, your ancestors, like mine, came to Australia with an understanding, albeit a rudimentary understanding, of what the society was about. Migrants coming to Australia know it's a liberal democracy, know how the rule of law operates in our country, knows that it has certain liberties, and there are certain liberal principles in our country. I mean, we don't ban homosexuality, and we believe in equality between men and women, these sort of things, which are not the norms in a lot of societies. They probably were the norm for your grandmother, actually, by the way, although she was a communist. She wasn't maybe
I don't know what I don't know what a Polish woman in the 1930s thought of homosexuals or of gender equality.
No, but that's not now. What people thought in the 1830s and the 1930s and what they'll think in the 2030s are all a bit different.
Right.
But there are norms in society. So in the case of the UK, somewhere between 35 and 50, it's not clear. 35 to 50% of all Muslims in the UK, who are they're not a big percentage of the population, 4% of the population, about 35 to 50% of them marry their first cousins. So that is in Pakistan, it's something like 60% of people marry their first cousins. So that points to a lack of engagement with the broader community. So, for example, cross marriages between cultures and races are a very good way of integrating people. But in the case of the UK, within those communities, they're marrying their first cousins, and it's not second cousins. This is first cousins. The range, that 35 to 50%, is a broad range because the data is a bit unreliable.
Yeah, how could that possibly be true? Because wouldn't you see genetic consequences among that population from incest?
Well, you see some, that's debatable in relation to first cousins.
Okay.
Some genetic consequences, but relatively small genetic consequences as compared to marrying or having children with your siblings.
Right. And is there, I mean, when you went to the UK as Australia's chief diplomat 10 years ago, did you notice that there was a difference between, I guess, the nature of multiculturalism in the UK and what it had been in the past or what it is in Australia?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I knew enough about what it had been in the past in the UK, and it's obviously something that's grown. The UK is a bit like France, actually. The two of those countries are, in this one respect, well, in several respects, but in this one respect, quite similar, and that is these are countries that had huge empires. So they, for hundreds of years, have had a reasonable percentage of their population who come from other parts of the world. And, multiracialism has been a component of their society. So what the great difference between most of Australia and the UK is not the multiracialism, because Australia is increasingly a multiracial society. And it says it's multicultural, but in Australia, migrants haven't gravitated into enclaves to the extent they have in the UK. There isn't that failure to integrate in Australia. So it really struck me when the West Midlands, they're called the Birmingham Police, took me on a tour through a part of Birmingham, which is entirely Kashmiri. So all of the buildings are late 19th, early 20th century British working class terraced houses and shops. But all the signs are up in Kashmiri. All the people are dressed as they would be dressed if they were in Kashmir. And the police told me that they don't spend much time outside of these particular suburbs. There are two or three suburbs joined together in a part of Birmingham. And, they were bemoaning this and saying, how difficult it was to police, that people didn't speak English. Only about half, I've forgotten what the percentage was, but around half of the people there spoke any English at all. And some of these people were second and third generation. Well, you don't see much of that in Australia. There was the issue of the Lebanese concession refugees who came during the Lebanon Civil War, or one of the Lebanon Civil Wars, into southwest Sydney. So there's a bit of that there, to tell the truth, but nothing like in the UK. So,
and were any of your contacts in British politics or law enforcement able to articulate how this has come about? Because it doesn't seem like it takes place in the US either. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in New York, which is the most multi-ethnic city in the world, and you don't have the same... I mean, there are enclaves, just like there is...
Actually, just correct you factually there, it is not as multi-ethnic as London is. London is much more multi-ethnic than New York.
I think New York boasts that it has the largest number of different languages spoken and different ethnic communities residing there, but I'm sure it's a line ball between London and New York. Yeah, they're fabulously multi-ethnic places if you're into that, which I am. But there is much more bumping into each other between different communities there.
Sure. They integrate. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time in New York because I worked for the United Nations for 6 years, but I can speak more for London. London is in the main amazing that you have different European people who work there. You can call them migrants, I suppose, from different European countries, from East Europe, from West Europe, people from Africa, people from South Asia, East Asia, and so the list goes on. People from everywhere, all interacting with each other in a perfectly reasonable and tolerant way every day of the week. There are, however, one or two enclaves in London, in an area like Tower Hamlets, which is in a completely one ethnicity. And in that sense, they separate themselves from the rest of the community. That's not healthy. But that is mainly not the case in London. Because I would make a vigorous defence of the British, saying that they are not in the slightest, I mean, of course, not 100% of them, but in the main, they're not in the slightest racist people. But I think people and human beings are in the main not particularly racist. I've always thought this argument of racism was massively overplayed, comes out of America. But the whole argument about it does. But people are culturalist. I do think that people like their own cultures and gravitate to their own cultures. So
doesn't that sort of become, sorry to interrupt, but doesn't that sort of become functionally a distinction without a difference in the sense that, and you said earlier that, this is not a racial thing. Let's set aside for the moment the fact that presumably there are racists in the UK, and some of the people doing some of the riots were racist, right? But if what we're talking about is,
they were racists everywhere.
Yeah, if what we're talking about is the sort of this. Oh yes, I have many East Asian friends who find it hilarious.
Our own society. If you want to get into the game of criticising, how about starting with some of the Asian countries where they're very racist?
And yes, some of my East Asian friends are gleefully so towards other Asian Asian cultures and Asian ethnicities. But I mean, we're white, so let's talk about us. Isn't the claim would be that, yes, okay, you might not be motivated by animus towards another person's skin color, but if you're motivated by a tribalistic bigotry towards their culture, and their culture overlaps perfectly or almost perfectly with their ethnicity, then who cares? We're talking about...
It depends what you mean by their culture, right? I mean, there are elements of their culture which for another culture are not going to be problematic. But if it comes to, don't want to sort of single out Muslims here, but it's just a bit easier to, I suppose. Take the example of Sharia law, child marriages, that sort of thing. Well, I think in a country like the UK, they do draw the line at that. And so people who might come from, I don't know, we're going to use your grandmother again. She Polish, did you say?
Yes.
People who come from Poland would naturally have pretty much the same attitude to issues like the law, and they wouldn't think that the law all comes from, some of them might actually, thinking that one of the popes came from Poland.
I'm pretty sure my grandmother was a godless secular Jew, so she would not have had a lot of time for the Roman woman. Catholic Church.
But they're talking about these things, sort of notions of God having created the law, and it not being for politicians to change God's law, parliaments to change God's law. These kinds of concepts, I think, would be rejected by most people in a country like the United Kingdom, and certainly in Australia too. So if people come to the United Kingdom as migrants and they demand the right to, have child brides and say that it's a God-given right to do certain things which are actually against the law of the land, then this creates a huge problem, because when the police, for example, try to enforce the law, well, that can trigger riots. And then the riots trigger counter riots. So there was a case of in Leeds quite recently, in the city of Leeds in Yorkshire, where the police and childcare workers from the local council went to a household and took a child away who was a Roma child, a traveller. They call them travellers or Romans, whatever. Thing about language is the descriptions change every couple of years, and if you don't change with them, you get condemned.
I know. I heard someone slip up, an older gentleman slip up in talking about people of color and use the term colored people, which to a young person's ear is incredibly offensive, and of course, linguistically, is just a tiny, syntax change. But yes, here we are.
It's a very good example. Colored people or people of color. I mean, honestly, or a lot of this sort of linguistic debate, this semantic debate, comes out of the United States.
Yeah,
because I spend a lot of time at Stanford University, I can see how it all happens,
totally.
And I know exactly who pushes these sort of lines. It's pathetic, really.
I've got Coleman Hughes coming out to Australia. Do you know Coleman?
No.
Oh, he's fabulous. You'll have to. I'll send you some. I'll send you some links. A brilliant young black writer, activist, and academic who has written the case for a colorblind society and is on the attack against neo-racism, as he calls it, the racism of the anti-racist left.
I must have a look at it.
Yeah. Nonetheless, so the Leeds story, yep. So there was a gypsy Roma traveller child.
The police and the childcare workers came and took this child away, and because they obviously the childcare department didn't think that the parent or parents were looking after the child appropriately, and so these Roma people live in a particular community in a particular suburb of Leeds, and they rioted. And then when they rioted, there was a counter riot, and police cars were burnt. All sorts of trouble took place, and it goes to the question of whether protection of children, which is a major feature of Western culture, whether that is going to have much of a role in that particular community, where they basically argue that it's not up to the state to make sure that we're looking after our children properly. We'll decide how we look after our children. So it's an example of where cultural values clash. And when they clash, something has to prevail.
But do cultural values really clash in that context? I mean, I would have thought that the conception of culture and family taking primacy over the state was a conception that actually, in another way, aligns with your small c conservatism, in the sense that, one wouldn't necessarily, if you transition this example to a Christian family or a traditional community that doesn't want the state interfering in, I don't know, what they teach their children about gender or sexuality or something like that, then we'd be quite comfortable saying it's no business of the state how we raise our children.
No, that isn't any business of the state. But abuse of children and neglecting children and abuse of children, I think at the end of the day, it's appropriate. There are laws about that. I don't have a problem with that. I mean,
right.
I think we all agree that abuse of children, in Western societies, we would agree that our definition of abuse of children, we have our own definition, but abuse of children, including physical abuse of children, is unconscionable. And we're happy to have laws that address that issue. So in the case of Leeds, I don't know all the details of what was happening to this child, which led to the intervention and the child being taken away from the parents. But, there are cases in Australia of this happening every day of the week. And it usually relates to not always, but often physical abuse of little children. So I don't think there's any debate about that. When what you teach them about gender or something like that, that is none of the state's business.
Right.
That you're right about that.
On this broader question of like the clash of cultures and the integration of especially Islam into the West, the sort of the thunderbolt across my consciousness, as it was for many when I was at university, was September 11th, that suddenly shook me to the core and shook a whole bunch of certainties that I thought that I had about the end of the Cold War. And, you know, as a child of the post-Cold War period, I mean, the post-Soviet period, I just sort of thought that we were triumphant, and that was that. I'm intrigued since you were
tonight.
Is
exactly.
it right?
Yeah,
right.
9/11 there were two huge watershed points for the West. There are three. I'm interrupting you, but
Please.
there are the end of the Cold War, 1989 to 91. We thought that the liberal democratic paradigm had been completely triumphant. And we went around the world just assisting countries in one way or another to achieve the nirvana of liberal democracy and liberal economics. And there are all sorts of examples of that, followed by 9/11, which was a cataclysmic event, really. And, Afghanistan, Iraq flowed from that. And then the global financial crisis in 2008. So the combination of those things led to the loss of confidence in that, what we might call the liberal democratic model.
Mm.
And particularly our politicians, but our communities have been flailing around. That's what they've been doing ever since. And our adversaries, the anti-liberal democratic powers, the ones that want to weaken that liberal democratic model because they see it as particularly an American-led hegemony, they have made a comeback. Russia, Iran, China, they're not doing that well, but they're doing quite well.
Better than they should be.
Yeah.
For the first and the third of those three calamities, you were not in a position of world-changing authority. But for the second one, for 9/11, you were one of the most important players as the Foreign Minister of Australia. Do you recall that day? Do you remember finding out or seeing it? What are your recollections?
It was the evening.
Yeah.
I was sitting in my study at home in the Adelaide Hills. And my wife was in another room next door, and the children were asleep in bed. And Josh Frydenberg, who's become very famous in a different context, well, a similar but not the same context, was a political advisor on my staff. And he rang me. And I can't remember what time of night. I think I was watching an ABC, the once ABC program Late Line. I think I was. And he said, you should switch over to CNN and have a look at these pictures coming out of New York. There seems to be a fire on the World Trade Center. So I switched over. And then over the next, whatever it was, somebody will know exactly how long it is, but a couple of hours, I called my wife into the room and we watched transfixed as the full horror of it unfolded. And in fact, so traumatized where we got the children out of bed, we got them to sit there with us in the study. And, one thing led to another. Then there were phone calls and things, and I didn't get much sleep that night, but I remember it very well. And I remember talking to my chief of staff, who was a guy called Mike Smith, as we were starting to organize ourselves and to respond to this. And I remember saying to him, I think this is an event that will change the world. No good will come of this. I remember saying that. No good will come of this. And I didn't think much good did come of it, actually.
No, I mean, and at what point, I'm fascinated by the sort of logistics of how governments scramble in such moments. At what point did you touch base with the Prime Minister, and at what point did you start to think, okay, well, obviously we're going to have to send some sort of message to Washington? Or, well, the PM was in Washington, right?
It was in Washington.
Yeah.
So that wasn't necessary. I mean, during the night, I touched base with him. I spoke to him, and
How was he?
Well, I mean, he was shocked, but what do you do in these situations?
Do you remember what he said?
I don't. No, he didn't say anything that's particularly memorable in that conversation. I spoke to John Anderson as well. I remember that evening.
He was the acting Prime Minister.
He was the acting Prime Minister. I mean, just to tell him what I was doing. I mean, DFAT has all sorts of.
That's the Foreign Affairs Department.
Yeah, they have all sorts of contingency plans for events like that, and lesser ones. And so it's just a question of putting them into action. They did a very good job. I tried to ring our ambassador to the UN in New York, and couldn't get through to him for ages. Eventually did. He had watched it all from his office window, watched the World Trade Center towers collapse. He was pretty traumatized. Anyway, a long night.
Did you have any time to reflect on the way in which things would not be better?
Yeah, so I had always fought against the Samuel Huntington thesis of Clash of Civilizations. I read the book. I met Samuel Huntington. I argued with him. Because, I mean, as I've been saying, and you can find common values and common ground with people. And I understand why cultures are different because I've visited, and I know this. I was in Peru recently, and it was the 100th country that I have ever visited. So I've visited a huge number of countries, and I can see why cultures are different, why people behave differently and organize themselves differently. Because of the history and the geography of different countries. So I've always been optimistic and thought, well, put people together in one location and they'll find ways of collaborating and getting by. And Samuel Huntington's more pessimistic hypothesis was the reverse, that gradually the world would atomize into competing and hating enclaves. So that I think was a moment where that was a real risk, that there would be an upsurge in antipathy to anybody who was Muslim. I don't know. I remember a week or so later going to visit and inviting the media to come with me to make a media event of it, to go and visit a Muslim school in Adelaide. Because I wanted to try to explain to people that just not all Muslims are the same. There are Wahhabists and Salafists and so on. There are extremists and fundamentalists. But, I mean, in Indonesia, there's not much of that. And you can't generalize about people who are Muslims, so don't think of it like that. But, inevitably, and there were other acts of terrorism, not least a year or so later, the Bali bombing. Yes, October 2002, the Bali bombing, which could have triggered a huge reaction against Islam and people who are Muslim. But I think we sort of contained it reasonably well. Didn't do a bad job in containing it. Certainly in Australia.
Did you go to Bali right after the bombings?
I did, yeah.
What do you recall? What do you recall of what you encountered?
Just shocking, going to the morgue, that sort of thing. Too many horrible things to tell you in a podcast.
Yeah.
I remember meeting, it might have been, and I went to Bali, met with the governor, met with the police commissioner, met with some of the survivors, went to the morgue, which was at the hospital, some of the bodies were just piled outside the hospital because the morgue wasn't big enough. The morgue only accommodated, 20 bodies or something. And they were piled up outside the hospital with ice on them. I mean, just grotesque, really, just grotesque. But I mean, I can't say, actually, Bali, oddly enough, is a Hindu part of Indonesia. It's not Muslim, but Indonesia being a predominantly Muslim country, I can't say it triggered any particular feelings in my mind against Muslims, because most Indonesians are moderate Muslims. They're not fanatics.
And if I'd told you in the aftermath of the Bali bombings that we'd be sitting here in 2024 and with a few major exceptions, there would not have been any subsequent acts of megaterrorism in the intervening couple of decades, would you have been surprised?
I would say if I'd known that, well, there was another Bali bombing 2 years later.
Yeah, and there was the London, attacks, and there have been a few.
Paris, Manchester.
Of course.
I think I would say if you told me that, I would say, well, if that's the case, we'll have done a pretty good job. And I think we've done a fantastically good job. I mean, it's a combination of the work that's being done by intelligence services, the intelligence collaboration. I mean, nobody's interested in things that work. They're just interested in the failures.
Of course.
But the collaboration, I mean, just to be parochial about it, to think about Australia's role, and I could talk a lot about America and the UK as well, and the continental Europeans, but just focusing here on Australia, I mean, I can say that I did this myself, which is something I very seldom praise myself. If I don't, who will?
I'll give it a crack, Alexander. I'll give it a crack.
But out of the Bali bombing, some good came, and that was the intelligence collaboration with the Indonesians, which came immediately after the Bali bombing, and then specifically related to the Bali bombing and trying to track down who the bombers were. But subsequently, the collaboration with the Indonesians over Islamic extremism in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia, it's been outstanding. I mean, we've done a magnificent job, honestly, having set it up then, and it's gone from strength to strength, including since my time as foreign minister. But since then, it's been maintained very effectively. It's been really good work. And we've worked with the CIA and the MI6 in Indonesia as well, the Indonesian intelligence community. And I'm here in Thailand at the moment, and we've worked with the Thai authorities. They've had their problems in the south of Thailand. The Malaysians, Singaporeans, of course. It's been fantastic. So we largely have kept it under control. And I think, by the way, a lot of credit should go to some of the leaders of the Arab world, because, we focus on President Assad of Syria and Hamas and Hezbollah and the theocracy. Well, they're not Arabs, but the theocracy in Iran and so on. But actually, if you stop and think about it, most of the Arab leaders are very opposed to these extremist Islamic movements, and have been very cooperative and collaborative.
In terms of, Alexander, in terms of the things that we've done in the past couple of decades that have served us well, and in light of your praise of some of the more anti-Islamist autocrats in the Arab world, was it a mistake to get rid of Saddam Hussein, who may have kept a lid on things better than the current state of?
He wouldn't have kept a lid on things. I don't think so.
Well, he was keeping a lid on things more than the chaos that ensued after the war.
No, I think it was right to get rid of him. Of course, you can have an endless debate about counter narratives. I mean, we have, to some extent, it's just a matter of judgment. I was going to say we have no idea precisely what would have happened if we'd left him there, but he was a huge problem. There's no doubt about that. And of course, this came out of an era where we believed in liberal democracy and universal human rights standards, counter-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. All of these things came together. And Saddam Hussein had been defying the UN weapons inspectors and defying mandatory Security Council, Chapter 7 Security Council resolutions. I mean, if he had seen us off, as he did after the Kuwait War, Gulf War One, I mean, he would have become a huge hero, anti-Western hero in the Middle East.
No, I don't mean if we'd invade. I don't mean if there'd been a war and he'd won. I just mean
No. If we had just backed off, we make all these threats, and it's in breach of Security Council resolutions, seeing off the weapons inspectors.
Well, I mean, we do that all the time. I mean, the Iranians would be less powerful. I mean, there are all kinds of regimes that we just have to sort of put up with. And
I think I'm not sure that, but I'm not sure that narrative is right. Actually,
you're not sure that Iran would be less powerful.
I am sure because this post all of this that we've been talking about, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. Post all of that, we have taken a view that we need to build a relationship with the theocracy in Iran. I personally have been slightly involved in that. I visited Iran as a foreign minister a couple of times, and without any real understanding of the trouble that they would cause. I mean, if Iran supported a two-state solution, and ceased supporting the so-called resistance to Israel, you would have a much more peaceful world in the Middle East. This is very unpopular within Iran. This theocracy is a huge problem for us. The Obama administration went out, turned its back on the Green Revolution in 2009, in early 2009 in Iran, and instead got into these feckless negotiations about a nuclear program. I mean, and Biden has done the same thing. Biden has gone back to that trough to drink, with all the inevitable results. I mean, that the Iranian leadership have played us at a break, and we paid a huge price for this. I mean, all that's happening in Israel and Gaza and so on, it couldn't happen if it wasn't for Iran.
Of course, but Iran probably wouldn't be as fearless as they are if there was a Sunni strongman in Iraq counterbalancing their power, right?
Really, I think it would make no difference.
Right. I mean, I suppose it's a counterfactual, so one doesn't know. But so your policy towards Iran, if you were emperor of the world, would have been a much more hardline one over the past 20 years?
Yeah.
What do you say to the critics who say, well, then they would just have a bomb because they would have just felt like, well, there's no point.
They wouldn't.
How do you stop them?
See, the assumption here is that the Iranian people are all at one and think this is one, and the West are out to get them, and Jews are terrible people, and all of these sort of things. Whereas none of this is true. The Iranian people loathe their government. They loathe the theocracy. This is the huge mistake we're making. The people who are on our side in Iran are the Iranians, are the mum and dad Iran. They're all right. Don't worry about them.
I know, but the argument for the conciliators, right? The Obama-Biden argument is you are likelier to win over those those winnable Iranians if you deprive the regime of the ability to cast you as antagonists?
Two things about that. Being seen by them to be sucking up to the regime is tremendously disappointing. As an Iranian, one of the leaders of the Iranian women's movement said to me the other day, 2 or 3 months ago, you've got to remember, we middle-class women in Iran will never forgive President Obama for turning his back on us. We will never forgive him. And getting into those negotiations about the nuclear weapon. This line that is used. I've written an article for the Australian, which will be published next week about this. About we've got to de-escalate. Well, what sort of message is that sending to the Iranian leadership? You're scared, right? You're scared. So we can just make merry with Hezbollah and Hamas and their militias in Iraq, the Houthis, and so on. We can just make merry. And all you'll say to us is, oh, naughty, naughty, but we must de-escalate. I would say to them, if you keep supporting these people, we will escalate. You stop your support for these people. It's when you stop supporting these terrorist organizations and when you accept Israel's right to exist within secure boundaries, that's the standard phrase. When you accept all of that, we can have a very happy relationship. I wouldn't focus on the bomb the whole time. I mean, if they build a bomb, they'll start a war.
Right.
And I tell you what, the leadership of Iran, having been through the Iran-Iraq war and before that, the 1979 revolution, the huge upheaval those people have been through, and the economic deprivation in Iran today, that ordinary people are suffering, the last thing they want, the last thing the public want is for the leadership to plunge them into another war. It would absolutely lead to the overthrow of the regime. The regime would have been overthrown by now if there was any leadership. But what the regime does is go around and kill all the people who might be potential leaders.
I'm fascinated, Alexander, when you talk about the Obama administration, about the peculiar way in which you ended up featuring in the 2016 election, and I wonder what your recollections are of the conversation with George Papadopoulos. I have a lot of listeners in the US, so their only entry point to knowing about you will presumably be that conversation where you were momentarily a global superstar, and sometimes referred to as if you were some sort of junior Australian diplomat, which I took great umbrage at. I was like, this is Alexander Downer we're talking about. But what can you take us back to that conversation?
It's actually much less important than it's made out to be. I was the High Commissioner, as in the ambassador in London, and I had a member of my staff who had a boyfriend who she's now married, who worked at the Israeli embassy. And this boyfriend knew George Papadopoulos because George Papadopoulos had done work in the Eastern Mediterranean. So that's why the Israelis knew him. Anyway, Papadopoulos was a foreign policy advisor to Trump. And this was at a time before the Republican Party's national convention, and Trump had got the nomination, but it was clear he was going to get it. And I knew, because I was the High Commissioner in London, that we didn't have very good insights into what a Trump administration's foreign policy would be like. We saw what the Democrats said. We could see what the media were saying, which was a very similar thing. But we didn't actually have any real insights. Anyway, this staffer of mine, she came to me one day and said that her boyfriend knew this George Papadopoulos and she had met him. And he was quite interesting because he was a foreign policy advisor to Trump, and he talked talked about Trump's foreign policy, would I be interested in meeting him? And I said, yeah, that would be good. And so we arranged to have a drink with him a few evenings later after work, and on my way to the inevitable dinner that I had to go to that night, as you do if you're an ambassador. And so we had a drink with him for an hour or so. It was sort of between 6 and 7. And at the end of the conversation, I said to him, well, I suppose Trump is going to win the Republican nomination. Are you optimistic about that? Well, yes, he was very optimistic. And then I said to him, and what about in the general election? Hillary has a big lead in the opinion polls at the moment. Do you think in the end Trump could beat her? And he said, yes, I think Trump will beat her. And he was right about that. And she will be damaged by the release of release by Russian intelligence of material they have on her just before the election. So I thought, well, that's a bit wild. So I didn't really say anything to him about it there and then. But later on, I went and told the Americans.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.